Let's not let Dostoevsky define the mid-19th century for us. There were a lot of other people there with him, and they were, just as complicated and multifaceted as we are. Let's not let Dostoevsky kind of silence them by the loudness of his voice and our amplification of it. Sometimes there's a confusion in academia and in general in our society between voice and power. They're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Telling a joke doesn't change the power dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not nothing either.
This is Mark Lipovetsky and Tatiana Efremova, and we are the hosts of the Scholarly ZEIT GUEST, the video podcast that we produce here at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. And in this podcast, we discuss contemporary ideas and trends in Slavic studies with the leading scholars in our field.
Yes, and our special guest today is Gabriella Safran, Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures at Stanford University, and also Professor of Jewish Studies, Comparative Literature, and German Studies, as well as Senior Associate Dean in the Humanities and Arts at Stanford. She is a true mother of dragons of the Slavic field, and we're delighted to have her with us today to talk about her new book, Recording Russia, that has just come out from Cornell University Press, as well as to talk about many other things. Welcome, Gabriella.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriella, for being with us. And we begin every session of this podcast with the same question. So the issue of decolonizing Slavic studies is on everybody's agenda, and we are asking our colleagues and friends, where should we start, and what is most important about this process, and what, in your opinion, from your perspective, can and should be done to decenter the focus on Russia and to make Slavic studies more inclusive, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that we're all thinking about a lot. I think that there's a lot of different things that have to happen. Something that's important, I think, is not to somehow mechanically replace our emphasis on Russia with an emphasis on some other part of the Slavic world. I think that we shouldn't, while of course we should stretch those of us who have an expertise in Russia, we should learn about the other parts of the Slavic world, of Central, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. But we shouldn't just say, I'm no longer going to teach Russian literature, I will teach now Ukrainian literature, Yiddish literature. Rather, I think we should, those of us who teach literature should start to think as much as possible, we should start to think comparatively, and we should teach the things that make us uncomfortable. We should teach issues around imperialism, around decolonization, around nationalism. We should rather embrace a kind of comparative social science perspective that allows us to say, what does it mean to be studying a part of the world that's in the uncomfortable, bloody process of decolonization and now revanchism? What does it mean to take this part of the world as a case study? We should be asking that, while at the same time we say, what does it mean to be immersed in a part of the world where you study the language, where you study the literature or the multiple languages and the multiple literatures, and you don't let it just be reduced to some kind of case study. So we have to somehow be on that border. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's a complete answer, but it's a few steps.
Yeah, that's most important. I think it's very important to look at our field not as some kind of the repetition of what has been done in subaltern studies, for example, in postcolonial studies in other parts of the world, for good or other worse, Slavic studies the world that we define as Slavic, although of course it's not only Slavic, but by linguistic features, is the place where the global tendencies first appear in the early stages, and in the early stages they're being aggravated to the extreme conditions, to the extreme states. It's sort of some kind of the lab where extreme scenarios are being tested on living people, unfortunately. So in this respect, we may serve as some kind of the, I'm afraid of this word, but nevertheless, avant-garde of global humanities, because we are looking at the processes that are to happen in the coming future on the global scale. Would you agree with this?
It's interesting. That's very dark.
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's bad.
Yeah, it is at the avant-garde. I mean, I think you're asking, you're suggesting. So one way you could think about what's happening is that this is the process that happened. We're now seeing a process happening in the Russian or the former Soviet space that happened earlier in Yugoslavia, elsewhere, and you're saying, no, this isn't a late example. This is an early example of something that will happen.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that will happen elsewhere. Why do you think that?
I'm of course it's not the precise ways of thinking, but I'm thinking by analogy, right? And what was, for example, the revolution in Russian Empire that seemed to be the basically one of the many collapses of empires triggered by the First World War, right? In turn, basically foreshadowed multiple and diverse processes that developed globally in the 50s and 60s. But here we have independent countries fighting for their independence from the colonial or imperial invasion, right? And looking back at the preceding relations and seeing that the imperial grasp didn't become easier after the Declaration of Independence, so to speak. So that's my feeling.
Yeah, I think there was this idea in Ukrainian studies currently that what's happening right now is a process of decolonization, which is strangely coming after the process of the post-colonial period, right? And it is changing the kind of framework we're normally used to. In a way, it challenges the usual timeline we would expect.
Yeah, it does challenge the timeline. I mean, and I think it's also really interesting to think about how this is not a north-south conflict. There's so many of the other parts of the world where this, some kind of dynamic of imperial power, decolonization, revanchism. So often this involves a kind of retracing of a north-south, or the establishing of a north-south binary, and of a binary that, at least from the perspective of American academia, looks to us like it's always about race. And so it's kind of fascinating to think that this is not about race. It's not north-south. In a sense, it's within Europe. What does that mean? There's a part of me that thinks, I don't know if it's an avant-garde, but that it's enlightening. There's something enlightening about it, that it should show us something. It should show us something. It should give us another lens with which to look at the rest of the world. At the same time, I admit that I'm troubled by the idea of seeing it only as another lens. I want to, because that seems to me too much to be adopting a social science perspective, and I'm a proud humanist and not a social scientist, and I want to retain my kind of intellectual and perhaps even emotional commitment to the specific part of the world and to think of it as a place where it's worth pausing and understanding it as its own case.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree with this. And speaking about emotional commitment, you wrote a book about 19th century, in which you, I think, in your own way, looking at the sense of listening, writing, recording, uh, you did what now is called the deconstructing the canon, because you were working with the classical literature, as we call it, right? But you moved away from big names and from canonized exclamation points, so to speak. So could you please speak more about this? How do you understand from your experience with your book recording Russia the process of sort of deconstructing or reconstructing, or maybe even going away from the canon of the 19th century literature?
I do think there's an enormous amount of work to be done by scholars and texts to be studied with fascination by undergraduates, graduate students, and some of those, many of them, I think, are texts by non-canonical writers. I think that we should all kind of take an example from the work of feminist scholars over the last 3-4 decades who have done just this tremendous work in curating, going back to the archive, finding things that were not canonized, that were published and read with great excitement. I mean, I'm basically a specialist in the 19th century, amazing women writers in the 19th century whom everyone read and loved, and then who were not republished and who sort of fell away. And now those have been rediscovered. Huge amounts of stuff has been translated into English, and I feel like that's what we have to do in many different directions. Whether we're looking at people writing in languages other than Russian, whether we're looking away from the novel to short forms, to popular forms, performance forms. There's just a lot out there, and a lot is available online. It's things that our graduate students can work on. I feel like we as a discipline, we as American academia in the humanities has not sufficiently valued curatorial work, and it has not sufficiently valued the work of translation, and it's overvalued maybe the kind of analytical work that goes into writing monographs. I mean, monographs are great, and I'm very happy about just having published a monograph, and I certainly want all my grad students to publish monographs. And at the same time, I feel like that kind of sustained individual analytical work is not always what the field needs. And maybe right now what the field needs is for people to go and say, who are all the people who are not Dostoevsky and maybe have different views and maybe are not as imperialist as Dostoevsky? Let's not let Dostoevsky define the mid-19th century for us. He was not alone there. There were a lot of other people there with him, and they were, just as complicated and multifaceted as we are. Let's not let Dostoevsky kind of silence them by the loudness of his voice and our re-amplification of it.
I like very much your expression curatorial work for translation, because indeed it's like designing an exhibition, making the materials that have been hidden somewhere available for a broader public or a broader readership. And you're absolutely right that, for instance, our tenure system is centered around analytical publications. Translations are okayed, but they will never bring a tenure, right? And there is this common assumption that, okay, so when you have a tenure, you can do what you like if you like to do translations, right? So, of course, it will take decades to change the institutional system and to make serious pioneering curatorial work as rewarding as the work of a scholar, analyst, interpreter, right? But in terms of sort of short-term plans, what can we do for this? How can we facilitate, for instance, brilliant translators that exist in our field right, and that do not enjoy as much acknowledgement as they would have, right, otherwise. Or graduate students who, many of them come into the field because they want to translate and they have real gift for translation. How can we support this, as you said, incredibly important aspect of our work?
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, and of course, you don't want to say it's not ethical for me to say there should be more translation, so grad students should go do translation when they have a limited amount of funded time in grad school, and they need to, and they're aiming at a tenure line career. I'm not going to push them toward translation work because I'm also the senior associate dean for humanities and arts, so I get how the system works. But I do think there's a lot of people out there for whom, if we, what is, it may not be within our power. It is not within our power to make the whole tenure system turn on a dime and sort of shift the values. But we can shift the values to some degree within our field, and we can provide incentives. And I think, I am a Yiddishist, like I work with Russian, but also Yiddish. And it shows me something about what it's like to work with a non-hegemonic language and a language that has never been hegemonic anywhere. And there's a kind of scrappiness about Yiddish and Yiddish scholarship and a kind of sense of humor that we can use, we Russianists. So there's this really cool thing that the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst does. The Yiddish Book Center is this little independent organization that promotes Yiddish study and scholarship, and by all kinds of people. It has a kind of view into academia and then a view into the public. And they run a translation fellowship where they, it's a contest, so you apply. If the sample translation you submit is promising, then you get recognition for your fellowship, for your translation. You get a little bit of money. You get a chance to meet other Yiddish translators. You get hooked up with a seasoned Yiddish translator, and you get a chance at publishing within a book series that's already organized. So we could do that.
Yeah, translation fellowships.
Totally do that.
Great
We could
idea.
do it
Excellent
for translations from Central Asian languages, from Caucasian languages, from all of the languages of the region, in a way to start kind of providing more materials for people to teach that are not just the Russian canon. It's not, I don't think it's a lot of money. And it provides some money and it provides some expertise, but it also, from the perspective of the people who apply for it and get these translation fellowships, it provides a line on their CV. It provides community. These things are really valuable.
And it pays for the time.
And it pays for the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No,
yeah. We can do
that's
that kind of
absolutely
thing.
brilliant.
And I think that's not, I believe that is not the only thing that is done in the world of Yiddish that could be adopted by the world of
Absolutely.
other languages of our Slavic region. And it provides a way to get out of the canon and to get out of Russian.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, this is fascinating. But I also wanted to go back to your book a little bit. I know you have this fascinating chapter that is looking at the accounts of European travelers who are interested in talking about communication structures in Imperial Russia. And they are taking part in the discussions and conversations that are going on around this time between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, and they're talking about a special relationship Russia and Russian Empire at the time has in relation to the West. A lot of this context seems specifically relevant to the kind of dynamics we see nowadays and the kind of polarization that's happening in discourse between Russia and the West. And I was curious to ask you how you see this present-day dynamic rooted in the earlier conversations about Russia vis-a-vis the West when they were just being shaped.
Yeah. I mean, I found it so fascinating to go back and reread some of these, canonical texts by Western travelers, and I found it really kind of poignant how a topic that these travelers and Russian intellectuals kept going back to was this kind of fantasy of unity, the idea that somehow what distinguishes Russia from the West, whatever the West is that Russia provides this example of societal unity, complete societal unity that is manifested in silence. And the West is imagined as loud, full of discord, which if you are Christian or the Westernizers, you think is healthy. You think loudness and discord and conversation are good, and societal disunity, or at least the willingness to converse and express one's views loudly is positive. And then if you're a Hochstausen and the Slavophiles, you think, no, silence is good and the Western loudness is bad. So I do think it's fascinating how these themes of silence and loudness are returning, and the notion of Russia as a space of societal unity is returning, either in kind of horrified tones by people who are oppositional, who mourn the sort of seeming unity of Russians who support the war, versus the sort of Putin side that says, indeed we are unified, and those who are not unified with us leave, and good. They leave so the rest of us can be unified. I think that probably it is a fantasy. Probably they are not unified. Probably people are not unified.
I think silence
In general.
doesn't mean, like, the absence of conversation doesn't exactly mean our agreement.
Exactly. And I think that that's true in general, but there's something really compelling about the notion of unity, the notion of societal unity, and the notion of silence. Those are compelling, and I don't think it's about the reality of Russia. It's about Russia as a space into which one can project one's positive and negative emotions. So I think seeing that happen now under using many of the same terms as what I see in the 1840s and 50s is really compelling. And in a way, I think the 1840s and 50s are more like now than anything that happened during the Soviet period or, from the 1870s on. There's something about this moment of very fast technological change and sort of a lot of conversation, a lot of international interchange, and then quite an abrupt turnaround.
I think this is very interesting, because we normally think about silence and silencing as something that comes in a very pronounced way with the Soviet project, in reference to the dissidents and Trotsky, and the theme of silence in many oppositional works of the 20th century, and the fact that as a concept it becomes meaningful so early on is really fascinating.
Yeah, and that it's not only, I think there are these two ways that I think scholars more often reflect on silence in relation to the Russian canon. There's kind of romantic silence associated with Chuchev and the sort of poets. Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. So there's something sort of really beautiful about that and philosophical. And then people associate it, with Mandelstam and this idea of, this world in which your voice isn't heard even half a pace away. And what I think is that it's interesting. Those things are fascinating, but what's interesting is to understand how silence takes on meaning, not in poetry but in prose, not just in Russia, but in an international conversation. It's like these things are part of much larger technological shifts. So when we kind of move away from our tendency to be Russian exceptionalists, then we can see the world more as it is. And that's something that I think we should also be doing now.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And this brings us back to Jewish studies, I would say. You already mentioned that what happening in Jewish studies can be very useful for renovation, let's say, of Slavic studies, specifically, perhaps, because Jewish studies paradoxically combine two approaches. On the one hand, it's subaltern studies. Of course, Jews are subalterns, other marginalized, repressed, etc. On the other hand, if we are looking at the Soviet period, of course, Jews are becoming the foremost imperial subject, the builders of the empire and the sort of leading figures in the 20th, not so much leading, but very much active in the following decades, right? So how do you see Jewish studies? Maybe it's our, dilettantish perspective. Maybe you see it differently.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I do feel that, I am just as sad and upset as everyone else about the war, but I feel that I was better prepared by being a scholar in Jewish studies. Mm-hmm. I feel that I was aware that this is a part of the world that is, just to say the obvious things, it's ethnically mixed, and relationships among these groups are not always very good. Even that, I think I understood it more deeply than some of my colleagues, Slavists, who were more shocked mm-hmm. by the beginning of the war. I think that Jewish studies offers something. It offers a model of motivation to study many languages. So if you were in Jewish studies, if you study Ashkenazic Jews in the Russian Empire, for instance, in the Soviet period, you can't do with just one language. You're sort of forced into a position of understanding that you need the languages of the subaltern people. You need the non-hegemonic languages. Those non-hegemonic people have a lot to say, and you have to hear what they have to say. Mm-hmm. And I know this very intimately with Jewish studies, but I believe it to be true of all of the other groups. At the same time, you can't only study the non-hegemonic languages. You have to study the hegemonic language too. You have to know the Russian sources. You have to know the sources associated with this state. And also you have to understand that language itself, its status is highly fluid. Mm-hmm. I think that being in Jewish studies, one is aware of the unbelievably startling shifts in the status of Yiddish and Hebrew so recently in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. They changed completely in how they were understood and experienced. I think also being in Jewish studies makes you understand that ethnic groups are not unified. Mm-hmm. To get back to this question of the fantasy of societal unity, mm-hmm. If you are immersed in Jewish studies, you grasp that Jews think many different things. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. This is, famous.
Not silent.
Not silent, but no one is silent. You go and listen. No one is silent, and I think sometimes I fear that we in Slavic will shift from our idea of we must study Russian literature, Russian culture, Russian high culture. It has some kind of philosophical truths for us that will benefit us. That's an attitude I think we're moving away from, and rightly so. But I sometimes fear we'll shift to one other group, and we'll be like, oh, that other group, their language, their literature, their philosophical truths, which we imagine is unified. Mm-hmm. I don't want us to go there. Mm-hmm. And I think if we look at the model of Jewish studies, we won't make that mistake, because we will be exposed to a literature and a history of a people that has gone through tremendous tragedies, but is not easy to define. Mm-hmm. And it's that visibility of the non-easiness to define aspect of the Ashkenazic Jews. It's so clear to us how divided they are, how loud, how non-unified. We should hold on to that. We should understand that.
Yeah, it seems like this productive complexity that's already inherent in the model you're talking about, and with the linguistic diversity already being there. But you also mentioned this joke about the opinions. I know that your current project is actually focused on Jewish humor and Jewish jokes. I wanted to ask you more about that. First of all, because obviously we would love to hear more jokes. If you have a favorite, please share. First of all, joke is not a novel. It's a short form. And then there's a certain dynamic there that already presumes that humor has this subversive function very often. Do you think studying jokes, and Jewish jokes specifically, can give us a new perspective on how to approach the subjects of empire, for instance, in the 19th century, in the early 20th century?
Or the contemporary world of
Or
memes.
the contemporary world of memes, exactly. How
Yeah.
about Jewish memes? Do we have Jewish memes?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So you want me to tell a Jewish joke?
Absolutely.
Okay. I feel like I should get Mark to tell a Jewish joke.
You're the expert.
I'm an expert. Yeah. I mean, I like telling the very classic, Trotsky telegram joke, because Trotsky's now out of the country. And Stalin says to the other members, comrades, I'm so glad I can tell you good news. We have a telegram from Trotsky. I will read it to you. He writes, "Dear Comrade Stalin, you were right. I was wrong. I should apologize. Sincerely, Trotsky." And then Rabinovich, because every Jewish joke in Russian involves Rabinovich. He's very busy. He's in all the Jewish jokes. So Rabinovich raises his hand and says, "Comrade Stalin, I don't think you read it right. Let me read it." And he comes up and he takes the telegram and he says, it goes like this: "Dear Comrade Stalin, you were right. I was wrong. I should apologize. Sincerely, Trotsky."
This is how community emerges, right?
Yeah, community emerges from the sharing
From
of
the
jokes.
sharing of jokes, exactly.
Yeah.
And from the ability to read them correctly, right?
I think it is important that, there is something about jokes because they, and this joke in particular, it is about language. Language is key. It is about voicing. It raises, but it doesn't really answer the question of, are jokes subversive? Do you get power from telling jokes? Rabinovich does not. If there was a real Rabinovich and a real telegram, this would not have been a successful subversive act on the part of a real Rabinovich, right? So there's a way in which jokes,
Slightly utopian.
yeah, it's utopian. I mean, I think something useful that jokes can do is that they can show us that voicing is not power. I think sometimes we forget this. And I also say this as the Senior Associate Dean of Humanities Nerds. But sometimes there's a confusion in academia and in general in our society between voice and power. They're not the same. Telling a joke doesn't change the power dynamic. But it's not nothing either. And I think that's something useful about studying jokes, is it lets us think about that space between having power and not having power as containing a lot of possibilities.
Thank you. Just from the practical standpoint, not to suggest you to create a short list of Jewish or specifically Yiddish canon, but think about texts initially written in Yiddish and existing in English for undergraduate courses. Which text would you suggest to use in different connections, in different combinations?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do think that Shalom Aleichem is great.
Shalom Aleichem.
It's super classic, very canonical, but actually amazing and useful because he's in there's so many different translations. You can find new translations that really do the stuff that we want. there's so much literature by women that's coming out now in translation that I think is useful. There's Sasha Sendovich has done some really great stuff with translating Moshe Kolbach, for instance. There's
Bergluson.
yeah, Bergelson. Bergelson is amazing. Bergelson is really enjoyable. But I think that one shouldn't limit oneself to writers who are still who are writing in the Soviet Union or in Russia. One should allow oneself to also teach the American Yiddish texts by people who came from there, or people who left the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, went to Israel, continued to write in Yiddish. We should understand this as absolutely a transnational phenomenon, and it's in kind of opening it up as transnational that we can find texts to teach. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Thank you. And
You're welcome.
before we end this, we want to say a few words about our friends and colleagues' endeavor, Tamizdat Project, launched by Yasha Klotz at Hunter College. It's a public scholarship and charity initiative devoted to the study of banned books from Russia and Eastern Europe during the Cold War. And since the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the project has also been dedicated to helping students from Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia who have been forced to leave their home countries and need to continue their education elsewhere, and to raise funds for support of these students. The Tamizdat Project is organizing an online auction, and this will be the auction where the books signed by everybody,
By
anywhere,
major cultural figures.
major cultural figures from Vladimir Sorokin
To Noise MC.
to Noise MC, right, will be sold on silent auction online, and all the raised funds will go to students.
Yes, please support the auction and consider donating to Tamizdat Project.
Thank you so much, Gabriella.
Thank you very much,
for being
Gabriella.
with us.
It was
Thank
a
you.
wonderful conversation. Thanks.
Thank you. Such a pleasure.